Who knew Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. better than his wife, Coretta Scott King? The world knew him as a preacher, a civil rights leader, and a man with a dream. But Coretta knew him as so much more. Through the 16 years they shared a life together, she saw him as a husband who shared his hopes and fears, a father who deeply cherished his family, and a leader whose love and sacrifices fueled their shared mission for justice. And after he passed away, she was determined to maintain that legacy so the world could continue to see him too. And soon, I'll... Welcome to another episode of I'll Tell You What, the podcast that's all love, Black history. I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that shares these stories with you every single Monday. If you just started following I'll Tell You What here after following the show on TikTok, hey y'all, hey. If you're watching this to disassociate from, I understand. Hey. Just as a reminder to everybody, new listeners, new watchers, all of the people, to make sure that you can always get your I'll Tell You What. Here are a few things you should do. 1, subscribe here and turn your notifications on so you know when a new episode or video drops. I will subscribe wherever you get your podcast, even if you're not a podcast person, because if an episode drops, more than likely a video, like an episode, has dropped visually. Also, and this is just a side note, but if you do that, please leave a podcast review, even if you're watching the show, just to help other people discover the show. But if you really want to know how to find I'll Tell You What, no matter what, for real, join me on Patreon. I'm so serious. Yeah. And you're helping support the show by doing so. So, anywho, last February, I told you all about the story of Martin and Coretta from their lives before they knew each other all the way through the very end. So if you missed that, I would definitely suggest that you go and watch that, But this is a different episode. This is a different approach. In honor of his recent birthday and today being Dr. Martin Luther King Day, I want to show you Dr. King through the words and the perspective of his wife. So, with that being said, let's start the show. So, do you know how we even got Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a holiday? It's because Coretta Scott King saw her husband as a visionary whose legacy must live on. So after her husband died, Coretta said, "Let me roll up my sleeves and get to work." She wrote, quote, "I can be a very determined woman. When I put my mind to something, with hard work and God's grace, it has usually come to pass." One of the things she knew she had to do to honor his life was to get his birthday turned into a national holiday. Coretta saw the holiday not just as a tribute, but as a way to inspire future generations to uphold the values he lived by, ideals of equality, justice, and nonviolence. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. It would definitely be an uphill battle. She said, quote, "Only a few close friends and religious leaders believed this holiday would ever happen, but I never really doubted." The movement gained its first legislative push on April 8th, 1968, which was just days after Dr. King's assassination. And this was when Michigan Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill to create a federal holiday honoring him. However, it faced strong opposition, particularly from those resistant to recognizing a Black leader's contributions on such a national scale. Coretta, undeterred, mobilized grassroots efforts to generate public support. She worked closely with the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, which she founded in June 1968, to coordinate these efforts nationwide. Through marches, public speeches, testimonies, and campaigns, Coretta brought awareness about her husband's work and the significance of his contributions to the civil rights movement. But as the years went on, there was an energy forming around the potential of the holiday coming to life. In 1980, Stevie Wonder wrote, recorded, and produced the song Happy Birthday, which was dedicated to Dr. King. After its release in the summer of 1981, it also became an anthem for the movement. Coretta also worked with Stevie and other influential figures to bring visibility to the campaign. She also helped amass petitions with millions of signatures showing Congress the widespread demand for the holiday. Her advocacy also extended to Washington, where she lobbied lawmakers and met with many politicians. Coretta framed the holiday as a moral and national imperative, appealing to the conscience of the nation and underscoring how Dr. King's vision aligned with America's highest ideals. Finally, in fall of 1983, all that hard work paid off. Coretta wrote, quote, "After 15 years of lobbying, 9 million petition signatures, hundreds of thousands of marching feet, telegrams from around the world, outreach from President Jimmy Carter and Pope John Paul II, the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday was finally a federal law. Congress passed the bill and President Ronald Reagan signed it into law. The first official Martin Luther King Jr. Day was observed on January 20th, 1986. After that, she didn't just celebrate and sit down. Along with the committee she organized, she made sure that every single state recognized the holiday as well. Since it was a federal holiday, that meant only federal institutions would be closed and federal employees wouldn't have to work on that day. However, those in local government and, of course, private sectors would if their jobs did not acknowledge the holiday. In her memoir, she said that in 1984, quote, "Only 27 states and Washington, D.C. observed Martin's birthday in some manner. It wouldn't be until 2000 for all 50 states to acknowledge the holiday as a paid holiday, 25 years ago." She saw her husband, as most of us do, as a legend, and she made sure to preserve that in time. But Coretta saw him in many other ways as well. So before he was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and when she was just Coretta Scott, she saw him as someone who could be worth getting to know. But she didn't know that at first. One day in late January or early February 1952, Coretta got a phone call from a homegirl, an acquaintance named Mary Powell. Then she was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, as she desired so deeply to become a classical concert singer. Did y'all know that? Anyway, Mary was a Spelman graduate who knew Martin and his desire to find someone to settle down with. So Mary described Martin to Coretta as a minister that preaches at his father's church in Atlanta and was in Boston working on his PhD. Now, Coretta said, quote, "The moment Mary told me the young man was a minister, I lost interest, especially when she learned he was a Baptist minister. Coretta grew up in the AME church. She didn't believe you needed to be fully immersed in water to declare your belief in God. That and the fact that she was essentially becoming more spiritual than she was religious. So she was pretty good on all that." But on the other hand, Coretta said, quote, "After Mary described me, his interest was piqued. Martin asked Mary for Coretta's number and eventually she obliged. He called her and they chatted on the phone for a while and then he asked her out. They decided to go out the following day to this soul food restaurant called Sharaf's and get some lunch. Now, that day, Coretta had her hair down and she wore a, quote, light blue suit and a coat. She wasn't one to put too much effort into her appearance back then, but perhaps she did look good enough for a first date. So when he pulled up in that green Chevy and she walked towards the car, she was underwhelmed. Her first thought when she saw him was, quote, how short he seems. And then her second thought was, quote, how unimpressive he looks. Despite this very disappointing start to the date, Coretta's thoughts on Martin began to change as they talked. She said, quote, in those few minutes, I had forgotten about Martin being short and had completely revised my first impression. When he talked, he grew in stature. She, as you could say, was starting to feel the kid, but then she'd be caught off guard once they were in the car. While at a red light on the way home, Martin turns to her and tells her she's everything he's been looking for in a wife. I'm sorry. After the first date? After talking on the phone one time? Yeah. Talk about intentional, okay? Coretta said she was, quote, shocked into silence. She was in Boston to get her education so she could pursue her career. She wasn't expecting this at all. She wrote, quote, my intellect hoped that Martin had not really meant what he said about marriage, for I did not want anything to stop me, to stop my career. And my emotions told me that this might. And you know what? She was right, because the more she got to know him, the more he was very honest about his intentions. And that led to their courtship, an eventual engagement, and wedding, which took place the following year in June of 1953. When she came to the realization that she loved him, she said, quote, I would go ahead and marry him and let the question of my career take care of itself. What a sacrifice. Knowing that marrying Martin meant sacrificing the career and life she saw for herself, she felt that it was worth it in the end. There were rumors of Dr. King's faithfulness, speculation that would linger for years and years and would be something Coretta would have to address more than once. Coretta said that when they were dating, Dr. King told her, quote, I wouldn't marry a woman I didn't trust. His intent behind saying this was to let her know that he envisioned a career where he'd be on the road a lot and didn't want to worry about his wife's comings and goings. He wanted to be with someone who he believed in and could trust, or like, what was the point? She told him she felt the same way. So where would the rumors come from, and why would she have to address them in the first place? Because in the mid-1960s, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were surveilling not only Dr. King, but his colleagues as well. Dr. King received audio tapes and an anonymous letter describing some of these alleged indiscretions and hinting that he needed to unalive himself in order for this to not become public. They were also intended to tarnish Dr. King's reputation and destabilize the civil rights movement, as it was clearly gaining a lot of ground. And of course, this was meant to destroy his marriage. However, Coretta reportedly dismissed these attempts as part of a calculated strategy to undermine her husband's work. She told Ebony magazine, quote, I'm certainly not naive. Martin was human. He was a man, not a god, not some perfect being, and I know that certain kinds of people would have tried to involve him in all sorts of things. But I knew my husband well enough, and myself well enough, not to worry about him. Now, some people assume Coretta was not ignorant to the reality of her husband, but that didn't matter whether she was or wasn't, because her focus remained on the bigger picture, the movement for justice and equality. And truthfully, folks are distracted very, very easily. So if she would have come out and been like, yes, I'm aware, what does this do? What does this benefit? Okay, think about it. When Coretta addressed the allegations directly, she emphasized Dr. King's humanity, his commitment to the movement, and their marriage. She wrote in her autobiography, quote, there was nothing about Martin having sex or anything else that resembled the lies Hoover and his people were spreading. She also told Ebony magazine, quote, if I ever had any suspicions and if that had been all I had to go on, I never would have even mentioned them to Martin. I was completely happy, completely satisfied, completely fulfilled in every sense of the word. And I'm sure that Martin was too. Ultimately, she saw her husband as a faithful, loyal man of God that was doing the work of the movement, someone who did not have time for any fallacies. And if he did, he would have confessed his wrongs to her. But that didn't happen, so why believe anything otherwise? There was a moment when she knew her husband would die. Coretta Scott King knew that he would not be on this earth for long. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. often spoke with a prophetic awareness of his mortality. As his leadership in the civil rights movement grew, so did the threats against his life. In 1956, their house was bombed while Coretta, their baby Yolanda, and a friend from church sat inside. And in 1958, Dr. King was stabbed during a book signing. By the mid-1960s, Dr. King frequently alluded to the possibility that he would not live to see the full realization of his dream for justice and equality. This sense of impending death was not just a reflection of the dangerous times he lived in, but also a very deep understanding of the sacrifices required for transformative change. A few of his most poignant expressions of this awareness came during two of his final speeches. The first was the Drum Major Instinct, which was a sermon he preached in February 1968, where he described his preferences for his own funeral. And there's the one he delivered the night before he died on April 3rd, 1968, titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." Dr. King said, quote, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." These words resonated as a farewell, filled with both acceptance and hope. But while he'd come to terms with his fate long before it was dealt to him, Coretta wouldn't be convinced until a moment almost 5 years beforehand. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Coretta recalled how Martin told her. He screamed from upstairs of their home. She rushed to join him, and they prayed for President Kennedy's recovery. But when they learned that he had succumbed to the injuries, Dr. King told her, quote, "This is exactly what's going to happen to me." Through all that they had experienced and witnessed, and even in the conversations to prepare each other for the inevitable, it was then that she knew that this would be the reality. While attending President Kennedy's funeral, she saw this as the outcome for her husband. She wrote, quote, "If they could kill a president, what did that say about Martin's chances for survival in America?" I believe sometimes God's protection comes in foreshadowing, just so you're mentally prepared for what could or would be. And it would come to fruition because on April 4th, 1968, standing outside of his room at the Lorraine Motel, Dr. King was shot and died at the hospital later. While Coretta knew the day would come, it didn't make it any easier when it actually arrived. When your wife sees you truly as you are, that's all that matters for someone as legendary as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And because of that, his legacy would not have endured as powerfully without the tireless efforts of his wife, Coretta Scott King. To the world, Dr. King was a preacher, a leader, and the voice of a movement. Coretta, however, knew him as a man, one who carried immense burdens, grappled with doubts, and found solace in his family. Her perspective of Dr. King was shaped by their partnership as she witnessed his humanity alongside his greatness. After Dr. King's assassination, his legacy could have faded under the weight of loss and political resistance. But Coretta ensured his work and vision continued to thrive. She spearheaded the campaign to establish Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a national holiday, recognizing its potential to immortalize his message. Beginning just days after his death, Coretta rallied grassroots support, lobbied lawmakers, and worked alongside other legends like Stevie Wonder to keep the momentum alive. For over 15 years, she worked tirelessly, gathering millions of petition signatures and advocating for the holiday as a symbol of justice, equality, and nonviolence. Her efforts culminated in 1983 when President Ronald Reagan signed the bill. Though Coretta's role was critical, Dr. King's vision remained the focal point. Even in the face of challenges, including rumors of infidelity amplified by FBI campaigns to discredit him, Dr. King's commitment to the movement never wavered. Coretta supported him not by denying his humanity, but by embracing it, understanding that his imperfections made his achievements even more extraordinary. And when he feared his life was coming to an end, she continued to be that emotional support he needed to help those last days and years be a little bit easier. Dr. King's enduring legacy is a testament to his transformative leadership and Coretta's unyielding determination to preserve it. Together, they created a narrative of love, sacrifice, and relentless pursuit of justice that continues to inspire generations. And that, Aisle Runners, concludes this episode of I'll Tell You What. As always, don't forget to subscribe, follow, share, leave a podcast review wherever you get your podcasts, even if you don't get your podcast and you just watch. It helps, push people towards the show. And of course, come back next week for another episode in Love Black History. Oh, and join us on Patreon. See you in the pews.